Lightning ripped the sky open and split a mountain-sized boulder like an enormous egg. Rangers Steve Anderson and Lena Hansen expected nothing more than a fresh hazard on the trail: loose rock, smashed trees, a blocked path. But when they peered into that blackened seam, the light from Steve's headlamp fell on something that did not belong to weather or time: a perfectly cut opening in the rock, like the mouth of a door someone had hammered shut millennia ago. They told themselves it would be rubble. Instead, the hillside was hiding a stairway into the dark. Steve had walked these ridges since boyhood. Lena, newer to the park but meticulous in a way that the mountains liked, kept a catalog of old trails at rock falls. The storm had been violent, trees down, power lines arcing, and the emergency sweep was routine. But the seam in that boulder didn't weather at random. The edges were tool-smoothed, the shadow inside too even to be a crack. The park's safety protocol meant they left markers and returned with the right gear. They were trained not to guess at history. Still, curiosity is its own kind of authority. They radioed the station, grabbed drills and shovels, and came back at first light with a crew, because what you find under the earth can rewrite what you think you know about the earth itself. It took hours. The drills whined against stubborn stone, and the air smelled like iron and wet rock. When they finally widened the opening, a black throat of steps descended into silence. Headlamps cut cones into the dark. The beams picked out geometric carvings, precise chevrons, and interlocking spirals scored into the walls in a style none of the rangers recognized as purely natural. Lena traced her gloved finger along a carving and felt the faint groove of a blade. The passage narrowed, then opened. The cavern was vast, impossible for the remote valley's ordinary history. It yawned with benches of stone and piles of objects half buried in sediment that had not seen sunlight in thousands of years. Tools lay scattered: bone awls, shaped stone, a few worked pieces of what looked like metal but hadn't corroded the way the rangers expected. Then came the armor. Bronze breastplates hammered with a design reminiscent of Atlantic-era motifs, shields with central bosses of beaten metal, swords whose edges were dull with age, but blades forged in a way that suggested a level of metallurgical knowledge beyond the immediate region. They marked everything, photographed, and retreated to call in experts. Initial heartbeat-level excitement gave way to the bureaucratic rhythm of evidence cataloging, air sampling, and chain of custody tags. The cavern became a site under quarantine, not because of danger to the public, but because what it might mean for history needed careful, controlled study. Archaeologists arrived with instruments and the patient, relentless logic of their trade. Carbon dating on charred fibers and wooden fittings returned an age that stunned even seasoned specialists. Samples clustered between 800 and 400 BCE, centuries before the era of well-documented oceanic contact between old and new worlds. Murals on the cavern walls told a story in pictographs. Ships with high prows, scenes that suggested long ocean crossings, and depictions of encounters between people whose clothing, hair, and tools showed distinct differences. The images were not mythic, they were rendered with specificity. Faces, anchors, traded goods, the mark of actual witnessed moments. Then geneticists published their preliminary results. Bone fragments, analyzed carefully and comparatively, revealed genetic markers that combined lineages typically associated with both ancient European populations and indigenous peoples of the Americas. It was not the clean signal of one migration or another. It was evidence of contact, close enough to leave a biological trace. The implication was enormous. Here, inside a split rock far from any known harbor, lay material culture and human remains that suggested transatlantic voyages, deliberate crossings, exchanges, perhaps colonizing attempts, centuries before the voyages often cited in textbooks. The academic world trembled. Conferences that usually argued about fine points now changed tone. Panels were scheduled, subpoenas for samples were written, competing labs called for reanalysis. Skeptics demanded replication, contextual stratigraphy, and more cores. Advocates argued for a reevaluation of maritime reach and a pressing reconsideration of how ancient societies interacted across oceans. The cavern and its contents became a fulcrum that could tip textbooks, museum halls, and national origin stories. A park that had been a quiet place for hikers turned overnight into a center of global attention. Archaeologists, historians, indigenous elders, and local communities gathered to map, interpret, and crucially to ensure the ethics of the work. The presence of remains demanded sensitivity. Descendant communities were consulted, repatriation conversations began, and every bone was handled with the gravity of people calling themselves to account for the past. Museums requested loans, news outlets sent crews. The site's remote beauty was suddenly crowded with conversations about who gets to tell history and how. But beyond the headlines and the academic jousting, there were quieter changes. Steve and Lena found themselves translated from rangers to stewards of a narrative much larger than their beat. Lena learned to speak in catalog numbers and context sheets. Steve learned to listen to visiting elders who read the carvings in their own oral languages and found echoes of myths they'd told for generations. Their names entered press releases and scientific acknowledgments, and yet what lingered most for both was a sense of responsibility, that the things they had uncovered were not trophies, but pieces of human memory. Long-term studies followed. Multiple labs replicated isotope analyses. Ancient DNA specialists refined models, and the murals were cleaned and conserved. The most careful scholarship painted a complex picture. Maritime peoples with advanced seafaring skills, voyages that ranged along currents and shorelines, exchanges that were sometimes peaceful trade and sometimes violent collisions of contact. The world did not pivot on a single cave, but the cave bent the light of history enough to force a re-examination of assumptions. Textbooks were revised, exhibits created with collaborative curation alongside indigenous voices, and new diplomacy emerged around the stewardship of ancient remains. In the evenings that first summer, Steve would walk to the boulder that had split under lightning and rest his hand on the rough stone. The crack had been a wound that revealed a deeper story, crafted by human hands, sealed by time, and opened by a storm. "We didn't find answers," Lena told a young reporter once. "We found more questions and the chance to ask them together." The mountain kept the caverns hush, but the world no longer treated the ocean as a line separating continents. It remembered that crossing is part of being human, and that history, like that boulder, sometimes splits open when lightning strikes. The park that had been a quiet place for hikers turned overnight into a center of global attention. Archaeologists, historians, indigenous elders, and local communities gathered to map, interpret, and, crucially, to ensure the ethics of the work. The presence of remains demanded sensitivity. Descendant communities were consulted. Repatriation conversations began, and every bone was handled with the gravity of people calling themselves to account for the past. Museums requested loans. News outlets sent crews. The site's remote beauty was suddenly crowded with conversations about who gets to tell history and how. Light the lantern. Join the journey. Subscribe.